Entertainment Weekly recently ran an online contest to determine who the Best Actress winner of all time is. After weeks of narrowing down the bracket, the voters had to choose between two finalists, Meryl Streep in Sophie's Choice or Vivien Leigh in Gone with the Wind. Vivien won. Gone with the Wind as a pop culture entity is discussed a lot for an 80-year-old film, and adjusted for inflation, it still holds the highest box office ranking of all time. By a lot. Gone with the Wind didn't just come out, find a natural audience, and do really well based on word of mouth. Rather, it had been a best-selling novel and had years of hype prior to its release, meaning it was an enormous box office event. Think along the lines of the first Harry Potter movie. Casting was a huge part of building up the anticipation. Speculations about who should or would play who was a regular topic of discussion, but finding the right Scarlett O'Hara in particular was a notoriously difficult and drawn-out process that in itself became such a phenomenon that it's subsequently been made into a documentary and a TV movie. If anything, the Entertainment Weekly poll proves that the nearly 3-year hunt for Scarlett paid off. In many ways, this story isn't just about Vivien Leigh. The casting process touched nearly every major star in Hollywood, and even more aspiring actresses throughout the country. It's a story about those women, contract negotiations, and a lot of patience. So how, after such a strenuous search, did a little-known British actress beat out the likes of Katharine Hepburn, Bette Davis, and basically all of Hollywood for the most coveted role of all time? And given that 1939 notoriously yielded so many great movies, how exactly did she end up with the trophy at the end of the day? The first thing you see when you watch Gone with the Wind is this. This guy is the key to the whole thing. David O. Selznick had been a producer at MGM and RKO when in 1935 he broke away from MGM to form Selznick International Pictures. He wanted to make big, ambitious, colorful movies and thought he'd have more freedom to do so, leading his own studio. In 1936, his story editor Catherine Brown got an advanced copy of a new novel called Gone with the Wind. The story basically follows a headstrong young Georgian woman whose life is upended by the chaos of the Civil War and who fights to survive amid various failed relationships and traumatizing deaths. Selznick wasn't convinced at first, but she was adamant, so they bought the movie rights for $50,000. 2 weeks after the novel's publication, it was at the top of every bestseller list in the nation. It was a huge hit. He was sitting on gold. Suddenly, everyone in America needed to know more about the movie adaptation, and everybody had an opinion about who should be in it. By the end of 1936, Selznick's office received 75,000 letters from fans suggesting potential Scarletts and Rhetts. Regarding Rhett, the consensus was pretty clear. Clark Gable was hands down the favorite by both fans and everyone at Selznick International. But everyone was relatively split on Scarlett. Bette Davis led a lot of polls, but we'll get to her later. So Selznick had a couple of things to consider. As an independent studio, Selznick International didn't have a huge stable of contract stars to pick from. Selznick himself admitted that had he still been at MGM, he simply could have assigned the roles to Clark Gable and Joan Crawford and called it a day. But at Selznick International, they'd most likely have to borrow stars for the film, which imposes some limitations. Those kinds of contracts weren't easy, and were sometimes railroaded for no reason other than someone just wanted to say no. But Selznick realized something. In an interoffice memo to his head of publicity, he wrote, "As to the casting of Gone with the Wind, I feel that new personalities are preferable. First, selfishly, because of my belief the roles of Scarlett and Rhett will make stars for us. And second, well-known personalities are liable to be identified with their previous roles, whereas a new personality will be accepted provided they are sufficiently talented and properly cast." A newcomer as Scarlett would be a good long-term investment that he could afford. So a nationwide search commenced, complete with full advertising campaigns and American Idol-like open auditions, where women showed up in period costume, clamoring to be Scarlett despite having never acted in their lives. Scouts were sent to Broadway, drama departments, small theater groups, and small towns throughout the South looking for the perfect unknown. Thousands of young women sent letters introducing themselves to Selznick as the soon-to-be Scarlett. To a certain degree, this was a publicity stunt to keep people engaged. Sure, they might find someone, but stars are stars for a reason. It'd be much easier to find someone with the right combination of looks, talent, and charm in an established actress. So in the meantime, they conducted screen tests and started conversations with studio players to see who could feasibly fit the bill. And it wasn't like it was hard to find actresses who were interested. If she lived in LA and she could breathe, she was interested. But why exactly? It wasn't just because the novel sold well or because people were especially eager to work with David O. Selznick. It was because of Scarlett herself, who might be one of the best female characters ever written for the screen. In an era when good and bad were more clearly defined for audiences, especially when it came to women, the breadth and complexity of Scarlett's story presented a different kind of heroine, an epic anti-heroine. One paper wrote, "It is a tribute to Margaret Mitchell's quality as a novelist that Scarlett is real enough to hold and repel us at the same time. We resent being made to feel so caught up in her interests that we actually find ourselves wanting to have the little gratifications and successes that her ignominious nature craves and strives for with such blind and dogged effectiveness." Actresses intuitively knew that a character like that would be an exciting challenge, or as journalist Frank Daniel put it in 1936, Scarlett will be a demanding role, one for an actress of unusual abilities, of qualities which can range from the sinister to the alluring. She must be young enough to play in the early scenes, in which Scarlett is an adolescent coquette, and mature enough as an actress to lend dignity and conviction to Scarlett's later experiences. Where this actress will be found remains to be seen. So the reason everyone wanted to play Scarlett was exactly the reason it would be so difficult to find her. Selznick had a peculiar challenge. Who could encompass so much? Tallulah Bankhead made a serious effort to win the role, but there were concerns over her believably playing the younger Scarlett because, well, innocent was never her vibe. Lana Turner tested but was considered too green. Miriam Hopkins, who many fans assumed would win the role because of her Georgian heritage and previous similar roles, read, but she never tested. Norma Shearer was reported to have won the role in 1938, but the public sentiment was so overwhelmingly negative to this news that both she and Selznick had to publicly clarify that that was not the case. Katharine Hepburn sought the role too, but Selznick had several reservations. He was unsure that she had the sex appeal to believably attract someone like Rhett. And if you saw my episode about 1941, you know that Catherine's career was basically in the gutter in 1936. Not to mention, the Connecticut-born actress had recently attempted a Southern accent in the film Spitfire. And,
If you get poor job, I won't rock you. No ugly face you no more.
I think the key word here is attempted. Paulette Goddard came closer than anyone else to winning the role and made several tests in black and white and color. Her personal life, aka relationship with Charlie Chaplin, concerned the team, but Selznick really liked what she brought to the screen. Now, most of these screen tests are available on YouTube, and if you watch hers, you can see why. She's quite good, probably the best alternative. She had what director George Cukor described as a shallow external Minx quality. That would really work for Scarlett. And then there's Bette Davis. Bette Davis wrote in her memoir, The Lonely Life, "I will be the last to deny that the nationwide search for Scarlett O'Hara in Gone with the Wind infuriated me. It was insanity that I not be given Scarlett." To a certain extent, she had a right to be frustrated. Most fans believed Bette would be the perfect Scarlett, and she had a streak of great anti-heroine roles to prove them right. But Selznick wasn't sure she had the sex appeal either. Still, he allegedly asked if he could borrow her and Errol Flynn as a package from Warner Brothers, but she flat out refused because, in her words, "the thought of Mr. Flynn as Rhett Butler appalled me." However, Warner Brothers, knowing how badly she wanted to play Scarlett and hoping to capitalize on, forgive me for this pun, Scarlet fever, came up with an alternative. In Jezebel, Bette plays a spoiled, antebellum Southern belle who pines for a man she might never get as she resists society's expectations. Sound familiar? David O. Selznick thought so too, and he was pissed. "May I remind you," he wrote to Harry Warner, president of Warner Brothers, "that the rights to Jezebel were repeatedly turned down by your studio, as by all other studios, until the public's attention was directed to Gone with the Wind." Selznick brought the concern about story infringement to the Hays Office, which regulated film content. Ultimately, the films were deemed different enough to drop the matter, but the public's desire to see a Southern belle come to life brought Bette Davis her second Oscar, just a year before Vivien's. So by the winter of 1938, There was still no Scarlett, though Selznick was inching toward choosing Paulette. Rumors were flying, and Selznick International's casting agents were still everywhere, interviewing models, radio personalities, you name it. Meanwhile, the rest of the production just kept moving. After finagling deals with other studios, most of the supporting characters and Clark Gable were already cast. The script was just about ready, the set, costumes, all moving forward. But they couldn't hold filming much longer. So that December, they went ahead and filmed the burning of Atlanta using old movie sets as kindling and body doubles for Scarlett and Rhett. Of course, still no Scarlett. But as luck would have it, that was the day David's brother, Myron Selznick, a prominent talent agent, came to visit set with his new client. David told an Atlanta newspaper in 1939, "I shall never forget when Myron walked toward me with Miss Leigh. David," he said, "I want you to meet Scarlett O'Hara." You might have known who Vivien Leigh was if you were really paying attention. Her filmography wasn't extensive, mostly in films that had been released overseas, but she had classical training from the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, an impressive stage resume, and the support of director Alexander Korda. When watching the films she'd done up until that point, it's clear that you're watching someone who is ready for a breakout role. It's hard to precisely pin down her type in those movies because of how skillfully she shifts her demeanor from character to character. She can play ditzy just as easily as intelligent, introverted just as easily as outgoing, which isn't necessarily true of even the best remembered film actresses of that era. The skill to display such contradictions would aid her in playing characters like Scarlett. Her best film, and probably the most consequential for her career at this time, is Fire Over England, in which she and Laurence Olivier play lovers in Queen Elizabeth's court. The two had begun an affair which of course eventually led to one of the most iconic Hollywood marriages ever. Now Vivien, despite being all the way across the pond, knew about Gone with the Wind too, and like every other actress, she was eager to get her hands on that role by any means possible. So when Olivier went to America to film Wuthering Heights, Vivien followed, sought out his agent, Myron Selznick, and enlisted him to help her win Scarlett. Turns out David Selznick had seen a couple of Vivien's movies already during the search, and had dismissed her because she was too British. And okay, fair, she is very British. But seeing her in person, it felt like divine intervention. She was quickly thrust to the top echelon of contenders and given material for a test. Less than a month later, her name was splattered across the news. She won the role. This was like a record scratch moment in pop culture. Most people were like, Vivien who? The publicity team had a lot of work to do to introduce this Scarlett O'Hara to the world and to get people excited about her. But it quickly became clear that the public had to be won over. If you've ever been on Twitter for any form of collective outrage, you have an idea of what the Selznick International mailroom looked like in the days after Vivien Leigh was announced as Scarlett O'Hara. Photoplay, a famous movie magazine, was also flooded with letters, mostly against it. Why the outrage? I mean, Selznick International had been recruiting actresses for years, many of whom were not very famous. People knew that Scarlett O'Hara could conceivably be someone they'd never heard of. Sure, some of the outrage is my choice wasn't the choice. Some of it was, I guess you'd call it bias. It was a big deal that she was British. More specifically, that she was a British woman born in India. That seems outrageous now because British people are like half the actors employed in America. But in 1939, people were skeptical that she could ever believably play a Southerner. She doesn't know the characteristics of a Southern girl. She hasn't even a Southern accent. In the part, she can hardly help but give an interpretation of Scarlett that will be criticized by every real Southerner. The Daughters of the Confederacy were so outraged that they even protested the film. Eventually, the president of the group relented, saying that the choice of a British woman was preferable to a Yankee. Ironically, Bette Davis, who was born in Massachusetts and frequently referred to herself as a Yankee, did not receive this level of criticism in Jezebel. About 2 weeks after Vivien was announced as Scarlett, shooting began. Audiences were about to see if she was indeed up to the task. As I stated in the beginning of this video, Gone with the Wind was pretty much incomparably successful. Every screening in every theater sold out for weeks straight. MGM, who was distributing the film, had trouble getting prints to theaters because they couldn't make Technicolor fast enough to sate the public's demands. Though 1939 was filled to the brim with incredible films, Gone with the Wind's ambition and scale was unparalleled. Better yet, for many readers of the novel, it stayed true to what they loved about it. Unsurprisingly, it was nominated for 13 Oscars and won 8 of them, including Best Picture. Hattie McDaniel won Best Supporting Actress, becoming the first African American to win an Oscar. The hotel hosting the Oscars that night was segregated, meaning she wasn't allowed to sit with her castmates or even enter through the same door as them. A harsh and bittersweet reminder of the work yet left, even in the face of such an achievement. But thank God, the best line reading of all time won her that Oscar.
You know what trouble I was talking about? I was talking about Mr. Ashley Wilkes. He'll be coming to Atlanta when he gets his leave, and you sitting there waiting for him just like a spider.
Rounding out the Best Actress category with Vivien were Greta Garbo in Ninotchka, Greer Garson in Goodbye, Mr. Chips, Irene Dunne in Love Affair, and Bette Davis in Dark Victory. Judy Garland was not nominated for The Wizard of Oz, but was awarded a Juvenile Oscar, an honorary award the Academy used to give to performers under 18 years old for extraordinary achievements. So let's look at them one by one. Greta Garbo was easily one of Hollywood's most beloved stars. She was also easily one of its most parodied. Her Swedish accent, her reputation for wanting to be alone. She was constantly suffering on screen. Losing a lover, cheating on a lover, dying, and people loved her for it. I love her for it. But times change, things get old. To MGM, Greta needed a revamp, and what would be more unexpected or subversive for Greta Garbo than laughter? Ninotchka presented Greta Garbo as a Soviet diplomat who meets an American diplomat in Paris. The two fall in love, and slowly her Soviet stoicism drips away to reveal the fun-loving capitalist underneath. The publicity campaign relied on the public's knowledge of the kind of movie Greta normally did. One phrase said it all: Garbo laughs. And she did a great job laughing. Critics loved her dry delivery and comedic timing. It must be monotonous, this superb rightness of Garbo's playing. She remains infallible. The film gave a new, albeit short, spark to her career. Greer Garson starred in Goodbye, Mr. Chips as the wife of a Latin teacher who she pulls out of his shell. I covered Greer Garson extensively in my 1942 episode, so I won't do too many details here. But what you need to know is that Goodbye, Mr. Chips was her first film in the United States, after sitting around for nearly 2 years, waiting for MGM to find the right role for her. Despite the fact that she barely has any screen time, that was enough for audiences to fall madly in love with her. This nomination marks the beginning of an extremely successful decade for Greer, who, in terms of box office numbers, was hands down one of the most popular women of the 1940s. Next up is Irene Dunne in Love Affair. Love Affair has been remade twice, and is almost shot for shot the same as its most famous remake, An Affair to Remember, which you might know as the movie Rita Wilson sobs about in Sleepless in Seattle. Well, Rita is me, because this story is tragic but lovely, and if you just want to watch two people be charming at each other, I recommend it. I think a lot of people, when they watch movies from this era, think the acting is a little histrionic and over the top. Irene Dunne is not that. Her strength is in the quiet, teasing moments, the under-the-breath comments that are witty and biting but always have an underpinning of sincerity. Love Affair and some of her other movies from this era, like The Awful Truth, are good examples of this. So if you want an entry point into this era, she might be a good place to start. The opposite of subtle humor is Bette Davis in Dark Victory, a film which Frank Nugent of the New York Times described as simply a protracted death scene. Basically, Betty plays a society girl who parties a little too hard with her friend
Ronald Reagan,
and whose life is turned upside down when she discovers she has a brain tumor. But as Nugent points out, the straightforwardness of the plot must not detract from the eloquence and tenderness and the heartbreaking sincerity with which Betty plays it. During filming, Betty was going through a divorce, and she claims that the vulnerability she felt during that time propelled her acting in that moment. She called this role her favorite in her memoir, but even she had to admit the obvious. I knew I would not receive the Oscar. Gone with the Wind had been released, and it was the sensation everyone knew it would be. Its performances were outstanding. It was going to cop every prize, and I had been around long enough to know it. So be it. She was right. No matter how good any of these women were, it really didn't matter. Vivien Leigh was going to win this. Not only because her movie was the biggest thing on the planet, or because she carried all 3+ hours of it on her shoulders, but also because America set the bar really high, and she far surpassed it. At just 25 years old, she took on an enormously complicated role under the leadership of a rotating band of producers, writers, and directors in a brand new country full of people who were ready to dismiss her and had very certain ideas about who Scarlett should be. Despite that enormous pressure, Frank Nugent wrote, Miss Leigh's Scarlett has vindicated the absurd talent quest that indirectly turned her up. She is so perfectly designed for the part by art and nature that any other actress in the role would be inconceivable. And he's right. She was the most delightful discovery, so utterly absorbed by Scarlett as to become her. In my opinion, Vivien Leigh, despite her awards, is not mentioned enough when it comes to conversations about powerhouse actresses of this or any era, probably because her filmography is so sparse. She only made 9 more films after Gone with the Wind, partly because so much of her time was spent on the stage, and partly because mental illness prevented her from working. But each of her choices are careful and distinct. As Scarlett, she gives a masterclass, and if any performance deserves an award, it's that one. If you're looking for an accurate and introspective interrogation of the antebellum South and the institution of slavery, Gone with the Wind isn't that. It martyrs the Confederacy as a noble lost cause, and it has an extremely cavalier attitude toward slavery. The African American community at the time was very vocal about this. This video has an admittedly narrow lens through which to understand this film and does not address its racial and political implications, or the very fair debates people are having about it now. Those things are all extremely important, and it would not do that conversation justice to try to cram it in here. But there is still a lot to learn from Gone with the Wind. Its PR, casting, expert performances, and how they were received say a lot about America and Hollywood. If the studio system and all its bizarre contracts hadn't existed, then maybe Scarlett would have been Bette Davis or Joan Crawford. But it did. And maybe if David O. Selznick had been a little more impatient of a person, he would have cast Paulette Goddard. But he wasn't. A lot had to happen for Vivien Leigh to become Scarlett O'Hara. The right person found the right opportunity at the right time. And as God is my witness, I'm at least thankful for that.